Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. Welcome to part one of my 3,000 subscriber series. Again, we got a lot of ground to cover, much like previous Q&A series that I've done in the past, so we got to get started. Again, if I don't answer your particular question in this segment, it just means it's going to be in an upcoming sequel to this series. For those unaware, I get asked a lot of detailed questions in these Q&A segments, so I have to break them up in subsequent sections or segments that air on YouTube over the next coming days and the next coming weeks. Reason being is, if I were to do these all in one session, it would be a 3 to 4 hour session. And nobody realistically would take the time to watch that particular type of video all at once. So we are going to get right into this because we do have a lot of ground to cover. First question. Sean, just curious what your thoughts are on trading a higher quantity of the later print Magic the Gathering cards for a lesser quantity of older cards. Thank you. It is always wise to engage in short-term speculation if you can make money in that realm in the antiques and collectibles trade. Short-term speculation is more profitable than long-term speculation. This is something that I don't think the Timmies out there understand. If you have a Magic the Gathering booster box that you paid 90 bucks for, and that booster box goes to $150, and you can sell that booster box, and after all fees and expenses, you make $40 in the clear. You are better off selling that booster box for that $150 than holding on to it, hoping that it goes to $200, $250, or $300. It is a speculative item, especially if it's a modern era booster box. Whether we're talking Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, doesn't matter. Short-term speculative gains over and over again is how you can make money in the antiques and collectibles trade. Short-term speculation is always better than long-term speculation, except when we start talking about historical documents, historical artifacts, coins, currency, traditional antiques. Those markets are more cyclical. They're not linear. Pop culture collecting categories in general are linear. As a result, you profit from them at the first available opportunity. You don't buy and hold in that market. Now, you're asking about vintage Magic cards. Again, yes, you should be selling a higher quantity of the later stuff, modern era stuff. And if you want to go after the vintage stuff, you can. That market's still speculative. But looking at Magic the Gathering as a whole, if you're going to try to invest in that market, either short-term or long-term, you are better off going after the vintage stuff, in my opinion. If you're going to put the money towards a moat, a workshop, a library, a gin, a moxen, any of those particular high-profile cards, yes, do it, especially if you are in a position where you can make money off of the modern era stuff. That's what I would advise you. If you watch YouTuber Scott Pratt, he has a channel on Pokemon and Pokemon collecting. He always says something equivalent to the older, the rarer, the minter, the better. And I agree with that assessment. That is a very 100% true statement that he makes in a lot of his videos. So I hope that helps. Next question. Sean, my question, what is your stance on the ethics of speculation? Are there instances where you know you would make a profit on a piece but choose not to buy on ethical grounds? I'm going to give you 3 different scenarios here as to how I am going to answer this question, and one of them is going to be very controversial. I guarantee you I will most likely lose subscribers over the answering of this question. So I'm going to give you the 2 less controversial answers first, then I'll give you the controversial answer last. So, first situation that I find myself in as a consultant in the antiques and collectibles trade, every once in a while, somebody will contact me who gets recommended to me by word of mouth, or maybe somebody in their family was a collector who used my services and left my name lying around, and this person unfortunately died, or this person is in bad health, and the spouse or a family member finds my name and reaches out to me and says, hey, Sean, I need your help appraising something. And let's assume the person that's calling in has a very rare coin that I myself would be interested in buying. Because I agreed to do an appraisal in this sense, I cannot offer to buy that particular item. My goal as somebody who is a consultant in the antiques and collectibles trade is to work from an unbiased standpoint. So if somebody comes to me, even if it's a proof gold coin, something where there might be only 50 known pieces in existence, and maybe this is one of the highest grade pieces and I really want to buy it, I am not ethically allowed, because they came to me as an appraiser and they're coming to me through the consulting side of my trade. I'm not allowed to make an offer on that item. What I have to do is I have to tell the person, this is a great item. I would love to own it. This is the fair market value. These are auction houses you can go to and you can consign it for top dollar. Now, if that person takes my advice and says, okay, Sean, I'm going to get X number of dollars for it if I consign it through this auction house or over here, and they choose to consign it to that auction house, I can then come back and state, just so that you know, this is something that I would be interested in. Now that you consigned it to this auction house, whether it be Heritage, Stacks and Bowers, or the like, I am going to bid on it. I hope you're okay with that. Usually they'll come back and they'll say, well, yeah, what do I care? I consigned it to the auction house. I want to get top dollar for it. So at that point, I no longer have a vested interest in that item. Once it's consigned to a third party, to an auction house, my work is done. I can then ethically and legally bid on that particular item. So that's a scenario where I put ethics as to being utmost important. Give you another example. In my consulting business, I'll occasionally get somebody who will contact me and say, hey, Sean, I bought an Avengers 1 comic book in CGC 9.2 condition back in 2008. Well, here we are in the year 2020, and I looked up the value of this comic book, and I could cash out at a significant profit. So I'm looking to sell this particular item. Since we've worked together in the consulting realm, if you know anybody who's interested, let me know. So 2 days later, maybe my phone will ring or I'll get an email. Hey, Sean, I'd like to do some consulting with you. And I'll do an introductory call with the person. And the person will say, hey, Sean, just to let you know, if you know anybody who's selling a CGC graded copy of Avengers 1 in 9.0 or higher, let me know. I'm interested in buying this particular item. Well, here it is where I have a client now who's wishing to sell that item. And now I have another client who's wishing to buy that item. It would be unethical for me to broker this particular transaction between these two clients. Because remember, when I offer consulting, I represent you and your best interests. If I'm representing both of my clients at the same time who are engaged in a transaction with one another, obviously it's a conflicting interest if I attempt to represent you both. So what I will do is I will say to that client, well, I happen to know somebody who's selling that book. I can't guarantee that you're going to be able to make a deal, but if you would like, I can mention to him that you're interested in buying it, and I'll give you his information, and he can get your information, and you two can connect. Now, this is where it can get a little bit complicated, because both those particular individuals, the buyer and the seller, are my clients. If they want advice on that transaction, they have a right to consult with me. Now, at that point, my goal is to mainly create a fair price for that item where the seller is happy and where the buyer is happy. I cannot take sides. I cannot say, well, this client over here has been with me for X number of years. You should pay X number of dollars more for this. Or this client over here is looking for a deal. You know, he had some hard times in the collectibles trade. You should sell it at a discount. That would be completely unethical. So I will not engage in direct brokering as a result. That's one thing that I will not do. So those are two examples where I err on the side of ethics. Now, here's the controversial example that's going to cause all the blue pill Timmies to unsubscribe from my channel. So before I state this, bye little Timmies. Nice knowing you. Hope you got something out of this before you unsubscribed. Let's assume we're looking at an item like Super Mario 3D All-Stars. That's going to be released on September 18th, 2020 of this year. It's probably already out by the time this video goes live. Well, we all know, thanks to Nintendo's handling of this particular item, that it's going to be a limited release. Certain stores out there are already canceling pre-orders because they're not getting enough copies to fill all the particular orders that they have for this particular item. Now, on the other side of the equation, there are speculators out there that are chomping at the bit to get as many copies of this game as possible because they want to flip it for profit on the secondary market. A question that I always get asked is, Sean, you're against that, right? The answer is absolutely not. I'm sorry, we live in capitalism. If somebody out there with a speculator mindset wants to go into Best Buy or wants to log on to GameStop or wants to log on to Amazon and they're allowed to order 10 copies of Super Mario 3D All-Stars and they can flip it for $100 a copy on eBay or wherever, I'm okay with that. Believe it or not, guys, my problem is with the manufacturer. It comes back down to organic collectability versus mass-produced scarcity. And this is something that I don't think a lot of you guys realize. If you're going to blame any party in that transaction, you should be blaming the manufacturer. And I don't care if it's in the case of Magic the Gathering products. Like, some people have reached out to me and expressed concern because they're upset because secret lair products in regards to Magic the Gathering are only available for pre-order for like 48 hours, then they close the window indefinitely. Well, if you're upset that you can't get your order in that time, you should be mad at Wizards of the Coast, which is owned by Hasbro. You shouldn't be mad at the speculator who was able to make himself available during that time frame and order X number of copies of that particular item, however he gets around doing that. So this is something that I caution people about. I am not against scalpers, resellers, whatever we're calling it. And you can hate me for that all you want. That is the true definition of capitalism. But let me explain why. Let me go into a little further detail on this, just so that you understand my full reasoning behind this. The item behind me is the Xenoblade Chronicles Definite Edition for the Nintendo Switch. Now, believe it or not, that game was made in smaller quantities than the regular release of Xenoblade Chronicles for Nintendo Switch. Well, the wonderful special edition here is still readily available for $79.99 on Amazon at present time, at least in the US. So if speculators would have went after that game thinking that the price was going to escalate rather quickly because it was quote-unquote limited edition Nintendo product, they got it wrong. So that's what I mean. There is still an element of risk that scalpers, resellers, and speculators take on to get their particular products. So again, my problem isn't with them. That's capitalism. That's how the game is going to work. It's always going to be that way. My problem is with the manufacturers who continue to create items of mass-produced scarcity that excites all the Timmies, and then the Timmies get upset with people like me for taking a stance in the middle where I'm saying, well, gee, I really wouldn't invest in these items long-term, but on the same token, I don't blame the scalpers, the resellers, or the people who engage in that type of short-term speculation. So I hope that answers your question. I just gave you 3 scenarios. There are ethics in the antiques and collectibles trade. I consider myself to be very ethical. On the other end of the spectrum, though, I have no problem with the scalpers, the resellers, the people going out that are bribing like managers of Walmart to get them to sell multiple copies of some of these games, some of these items that they're flipping on the secondary market. That never bothered me. That's all a part of capitalism. If you are against that, you should be against the manufacturers. And most of the rage that I see, rather than being geared towards the manufacturers, is geared towards the scalpers and the resellers. And I never could understand why. Your problem in that scenario is Nintendo. It's not the guy down the street who woke up early on Friday, September 18th, went to a Best Buy, and was able to get the cashier to sell him 5 copies of Super Mario 3D All-Stars. Because there always is a chance that that speculative bet may not pay off, and he may be stuck with those 5 copies. So it's risk versus reward, guys. It is what it is. Next question. Sean, can you explain why something that is marketed as collector's edition or limited collector's edition aren't actually collectible? It comes back to organic collectability versus manufactured scarcity. Let me give you this as an example, and I know for my longtime viewers and subscribers, I've used this example over 1 million times. I'm exaggerating, but it's been many times that I've used this example. But we do have a lot of new people who subscribe to this channel, so give me 2 minutes just to explain it to them. If you guys remember back in 1993 when Magic the Gathering came out, Wizards of the Coast would test market and they would test play the game Magic the Gathering. Well, back then, they used to hand every player a pack of alpha cards. Alpha Edition cards. Well, some of those players just by default got some of the Alpha Edition Mox cards. They got the Black Lotus. They got all these cards today that would be worth a fortune on the secondary market. Are you aware, back in 1993, when players were test playing that game to see if they would like it, when they were done playing the game, rather than taking the cards with them, they actually left them on the table. They did not even bother to think that those particular items would be valuable someday in the future. That is an example of organic collectability. Let me give you another example. Most of you out there, if you collect video games, or even if you know of video game collectibles, you've probably heard of the game Stadium Events. Stadium Events was the Bandai edition, that's the company that manufactured it, of World Class Track Meet. Well, Stadium Events was put into production before it was finalized that they had the license to produce that game. Nintendo came along, bought the license, and now Bandai had to cease production of that game, but several thousand copies got out. Nobody back in 1986, 1987 thought that Stadium Events would be worth thousands of dollars today. So nobody bothered to run to the store and buy up multiple copies of Stadium Events and keep them sealed, except for Tim Atwood. Bless you, my friend. You were very wise. But everybody else didn't have that type of foresight, okay? Well, that's an example of organic collectability. Now, let's look at mass-produced scarcity. You ever hear of the company Limited Run Games? How about Strictly Limited Games? How about Play Asia Play Exclusives? Those are examples of mass-produced scarcity. Funko Pops, another great example of mass-produced scarcity. Beanie Babies, third example of mass-produced scarcity. Now, I know some of you are probably asking, well, Sean, why aren't limited run games a form of organic collectability? Well, it's very simple. They're creating a product that was meant to be released digitally. They're limiting the production runs, and everybody who is buying those games, almost all the people out there that are running after plunking down their credit card for a limited run release, a lot of those people are going to keep it factory sealed. They're never going to open it. And in their minds, they think it's going to become the next Stadium Events. Well, I just told you why that's not possible. Back when Stadium Events came out, nobody thought it would be a big collectible. That's organic collectability. Limited run games, Super Mario 3D All-Stars, those items are mass-produced scarcity. Collector boxes, Magic the Gathering, some of the masterpieces, the lottery cards, those are all a form of mass-produced scarcity. Can those items become worth money? Yes. Are they ever going to be on par with an Alpha Edition Black Lotus or a copy of Stadium Events or even a factory sealed copy of Super Mario Bros. 3? No. There's no organic collectability there. They were marketed for collectors, speculators, and the Timmies out there who don't know any better. That's why they are not good long-term investments. I tell people this all the time. If you have a game that you bought from Limited Run, you have it factory sealed, you paid $40 for it, you could sell it for $80, by all means, sell it, get the money, and move on. It's not waiting for a game like that to go to 100, 120, 150. It's most likely not going to happen, guys. The market is just not there as of yet. It's too much mass-produced scarcity and not enough organic collectability. That said, fair disclaimer, Limited Run Games makes a great product. Okay? Next question. What are your favorite coins produced between the years 1940 to 2021? You're going to hate me for answering the question this way, but unless if it is a coin that I'm buying solely for its bullion value, which I don't do a lot of, more on that in another Q&A series, none. I like classic U.S. coins that were minted from the 1700s all the way up, ironically, to 1940. The oldest coin that I have in my investment-grade coin collection is a 1938D Walking Liberty half because it is a key to the series. There was only less than 500,000 coins from that year and that mint mark minted, if I remember correctly. So I will go all the way up to 1940. I will not go further because coin collecting was already a mature market almost by that particular point. There were too many people involved in the market in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. As a result, every coin that was pretty much released by the U.S. Mint was gobbled up in uncirculated rolls by collectors. There are a few circumstances where that is not true. I fully acknowledge that. But overall, a lot of the coins that were made after the 1940s, 50s, and 60s were pretty much saved by coin collectors in everyday life. That's why I don't like coin collecting post 1940, to answer your question. Next question. Hey, Sean, can you explain when to insure your collection depending on the worth and the type of collection you have? There's going to be a whole video devoted to this. For me to answer this question realistically in this Q&A, it would take me 20 to 30 minutes to do so. When you start seeing those videos, it's actually going to be a multi-series video that talks about insurance, that talks about why insurance can be wise, the pros and cons of insurance, how to gauge whether you need insurance on the items you collect. In my opinion, probably 80 to 90% of all collectors out there who collect on a long-term basis should have some type of policy, insurance policy, geared towards the collectibles that they have, the collectibles that they do collect or invest in. Next question. Sean, you mentioned the linear nature of pop culture bull markets associated with action figures, toys, etc. Can you please go into greater detail on the time horizon of this pattern as related to the literal life cycles of collectors caught up in personal nostalgia? This is what I tell you. There is an unspoken rule in the antiques and collectibles trade. Overall, without few exceptions, meaning there are some exceptions that I'm going to name towards the end of this sentiment, but I do want to make this statement. Overall, the generation that grew up with the item in question is the generation that will most likely always pay the highest price for it. So if you want to gauge market peaks, all you have to do is look at the generation that grew up with that particular item, if it's a pop culture item, and understand that since it's not historic, it's not on the antique side of the trade, we're dealing with collectibles, the particular market for that particular item is linear more than cyclical. That reasoning is the person like me who grew up with Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, vintage video games, a person from my particular demographic, my age group, my generation, is more likely to pay a high price or a record price for that item than someone that comes after me. Does that make sense? Meaning, this is one of the criticisms I give towards video game collectors out there, Pokemon collectors, even Magic the Gathering collectors. The generation that's going to covet your items is going to be you, the generation that you grew up in. Younger generations may gravitate towards collecting those particular items, but overall, when it comes to pop culture, there's going to be less collectors in that market after the generation that grew up with those items moved on. Let me give you two examples, one where this worked perfectly, and one where some of the Timmies who come on this channel and criticize me, who don't understand how the antiques and collectibles trade works, they use an example, but they don't understand the fundamentals of that example. So let me explain. The first example I'm going to use is the market for Western toys and collectibles. Somebody who grew up in the 1940s, the 1950s, even the 1960s was exposed to the Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Hopalong Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, all those Western toys, franchises, and collectibles. Well, as luck would have it, or if you've studied the antiques and collectibles trade, as market cycles would have it, those particular items peaked in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now let's analyze this. Why did collectibles based on the Lone Ranger, Bonanza, Gunsmoke, why did these items peak in the 1980s and the 1990s? The generation that grew up exposed to those particular pop culture artifacts at the time came of age in the 80s or 90s. They were willing to pay a peak for those items at present time. It's just like what's happening with Pokemon right now. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, even before the internet existed, the trade was very fragmented at that time. But there were still record prices being reported for certain metal lunchboxes or Mark's Western play sets that featured all these franchises and licensees, whether they were Western oriented or they were based on the Lone Ranger and the like. Well, today, that market, it's still there, but it's in shambles. Reason being, younger generations aren't into the Lone Ranger. They're not into Gunsmoke. They're not into Bonanza. And they're not into Hopalong Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It just didn't happen. So as a result, those prices peaked. Then they started to fall. Now, one of the things I get thrown at me from the Timmies, well, Sean, look at comic books. Superman and Batman appeared in 1939. The generation that grew up with those particular items would have peaked in the 80s or 90s. How come comic books are still soaring to all-time highs in the year 2020? Well, let me explain it to you, little Timmy S. Poindexter Jr. This is what you're not understanding. There were catalysts that affected the comic book marketplace that make it what it is today. Let me go into further detail. If you chart the prices of Golden Age and Silver Age and even Bronze Age comic books, a lot of those particular comic books peaked in the 1990s. This is fact. If you were to take a time machine back to the 1990s, before third-party grading came along, before Disney bought Marvel and started releasing movies every 3 months based on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, guess what? You would see an interesting trend develop. In the 1990s, you could have bought a very fine plus or a near mint copy of Action Comics 1, Detective Comics 27, or even Amazing Fantasy 15 for literally several $100s or in some case, several $1,000s. The market was not where it is today. The original collectors of those items started to move away from that market because they matured, they moved on. Some of them ended up in nursing homes. Some of them ended up 6 feet under. Some of them ended up in a vintage priceless urn that stands on your wonderful fireplace mantle that contains their ashes. So where am I going with this? What caused the price increases in CGC graded comic books? It was in the year 2000 and 2001, CGC hit the scene, and it caused a massive catalyst of comic grading, comic speculators, comic investors coming into the market, starting to pay a premium for these items. But wait, there is more. In 2007, 2008, what happened? Marvel said, we're going to start bringing in a lot of these popular comic book characters into the silver screen. And people were skeptical at first, but they were excited. Well, when Marvel did that with Iron Man, then they started going into the Avengers, Thor. Guess what happened? Prices exploded even further for vintage comic books. So vintage comic books are not a prime example of a market that is linear. It got breathed a new breath of life in it in the year 2000 after the market already cooled off when the initial generation who collected those books started to move on. So that's why you guys that come at me and say, well, look at comic books. They didn't follow that same trajectory. You're correct, little Timmy. But what you're not understanding is there's two catalysts there that you're not bringing to fruition to explain the reasoning for those price movements. And I'm going to tell you something right now. In the future, I've said this before, 10, 20 years out, I think most comic books are going to fall in value. The market is not comparable to coins, to currency, to historical artifacts. It's not on par with those historical markets overall. There is a variance. The market for vintage comic books, even at present time, even though it is an established market in the collectibles trade, it is too speculative. It is based too much on pop culture, movies that are coming in the pipeline. When we look at books like Werewolf by Night 32 or Blade the Vampire Slayer, Tomb of Dracula 10, his first appearance, because he has a movie coming out, that book is starting to soar in value. There's too much of a symbiotic relationship with Hollywood at present time that a lot of the speculators are not learning from. I've said this before, I'll say it again. You sell into the movie hype. You don't buy into it. A lot of these speculators in the vintage comic book market do not understand this concept. The time to buy a copy of Tomb of Dracula 10 or Werewolf by Night 32 is not when they start talking about movies made for those characters that came out of those comic books. The time to buy those comic books is when there are no big news announcements because the price is generally flat. That's why I tell people right now is a good time to go after certain Fantastic Four books. Avengers 57, The Vision has been done to death. That book started to decline a little bit in value. Amazing Spider-Man 129, there's a book that kind of leveled off a little bit. Even Amazing Fantasy 15, there's a book that pulled back a little bit over the last few months, last few years. So those are the examples of the books where if you're going to try to invest in these items, go after the books where the action isn't. And that's what everybody gets wrong. So I hope I answered your question in general, that you can see the similarities between the markets that I decided to use as an example in this statement. If not, let me know in the comment section below and I'll expand on it further. Next question. Sean, do you see sealed video game consoles as having the same sort of growth potential as sealed video games? Here's the problem with that. Right now, WADA is the standard in vintage video game grading. The problem that you have when it comes to video game consoles, WADA uses prefabricated cases. As a result, they are not at present time, in most cases, to my knowledge, grading video game systems. Video game systems are graded solely by VGA. VGA is a very reputable company, in my opinion. They use a different grading scale. Be aware of that if you invest in factory sealed graded video games. But overall, VGA is a reputable company. The problem you're going to have, and most people are not aware of this, and that's why I waited to answer this question 31 minutes in, is WADA Games has a financial vested interest from the owners of Comic Link and Certified Link, and also Heritage Auctions. So you cannot consign VGA-related items to Heritage Auctions or Certified Link at present time. So the market for graded video game consoles, which can only be graded at present time by VGA, is limited to eBay. So that's the problem you have. If WADA Games would ever get into that market, if they would create different sized prefabricated cases that would handle a vintage Nintendo Entertainment System that's factory sealed, or a 3DS system, or what have you, yes, that market would have a viable sustainability from the speculators, from the Timmies, from the Poindexters out there that will pay a premium for that particular stuff. That's all I'm going to say. Next question. Sean, what do you think of Magic the Gathering Secret Lairs? Short term, long term. Magic the Gathering Secret Lairs are a prime example of mass-produced scarcity. Now, what makes them unique is they're only available on the market for 48 hours and on average, and it is a print-to-demand product. Therefore, over the next coming years, there might be some opportunity in that market, but normally what I tell people is if you're going after a secret lair product, you buy one for $40 and you can sell it for $80. It's better off to sell it into the market for that $80, take your profit and go after something else, rather than holding on to some of these items for 5-10 years, hoping that that $40 item is going to go for $100, $200, $300 sometime down the line. That's just my opinion. Again, short-term speculative gains in the antiques and collectibles trade are better than long-term speculative gains overall, especially when we're dealing with mass-produced scarcity. Always remember that, guys. Next question. Sean, do people really buy ornaments anymore? If you mean Christmas ornaments, Halloween decorations, Easter ornaments that are of a vintage or antique age, the answer is yes. It's a very esoteric market. I would never tell anybody to go into the market, buy vintage or antique ornaments with the mindset that they're going to be able to sell them 10, 20, 30 years later for a premium. Again, it's a very esoteric market. There are people, though, that have the money that want to go into the market and they want to get authentic, antique, or vintage Christmas ornaments or decorations, and they will, a lot of times, use them to decorate around the holidays. And as a result, that market does have legs, but again, it's not meant for investment, if that's what you're asking. Next question. Congrats on 3,000 subscribers. What do you think about the recent Heritage auction of the Pokemon First Edition base box going for $198,000? Again, in my opinion, it's a very speculative market. It's high risk. There's a lot of people getting into this market right now, like Gary Vee, other celebrities, other YouTubers, other influencers of social media. As a result, there's a lot of money flowing into that market. Remember, guys, no market can go up exponentially over the long term. At some point, it's going to hit an inflection point and it's going to correct. And when that happens, all the Timmies that come in on my channel and they go, Sean, what about Pokemon? You're always picking on Pokemon. Why are you so against Charizard and Pikachu? The reason is, guys, Charizard and Pikachu were only terms up until the year 1999. Pokemon in the United States is only 21 years of age on average. Are you guys aware of that? I have coins in my collection from 1792. So let's analyze those markets. Let me know when Pokemon gets to 50 years of age. Then we'll have this conversation again. Okay, now I don't know about you. I'm going to be 44 years of age in December of this year. I really don't want to sit around and wait until I'm 74 to see how the Pokemon market did. It's not a market for me, guys. Again, you want to get into it. You want to speculate into it. I do hold certain Pokemon products of the vintage variety. They are sitting in a safety deposit box. I just haven't had the inclination to pull them out and sell them. But overall, it's not something I'm overtly attached to. I'm going to be 100% honest. The market, in my opinion, is way too speculative. Just like how I feel with vintage video games, graded video games, and even Magic the Gathering to a lesser extent. But I will tell you, I do have a passion towards Magic the Gathering, more so than that of Pokemon. Full disclosure. Next question. Hey, reserved investments, what about food collecting? Is it worth it? When I first read this question, I honestly thought I was being trolled. But luckily, I did read on. Example, I was thinking about buying a box of vintage Nintendo cereal still in the box. Is this a good investment? Absolutely not. Please do not do this. Any type of food product collecting due to the packaging is very esoteric. Overall, it is something that the hoarders engage in. It is not a viable collecting market. I do know there are certain products, and I don't want to insult anybody, that are out there on the secondary market, like a box of Wheaties that had a certain athlete, or in this case, a box of Nintendo cereal from the Nintendo cereal system line from the late 1980s that do sell for a premium. It is not worth investing in long term. It is more of a curiosity. It is something that somebody kept that just represents a different time period that someone may be nostalgic for. But overall, it's not something you want to have in your house, especially if that box starts moving. That could mean that there is a bug infestation in that particular cereal box. I do not buy any type of product that is spoiled or may be collectible that is of a food product or otherwise. It's just not for me. Next question, and this will be the last question for this particular Q&A series, meaning part 1. We will have a part 2. We will most likely have a part 3. So this is the question. What do you think about investing in high-end timepieces such as Rolex, Patek Philippe? Did I say that right? I'm not French. And to some extent, Omega. I've said this many times before. I do like the vintage timepiece market. So if you want to go after a vintage Rolex, another one of these vintage watches, by all means, go for it. Just know that you're going to have some serious money to play in this market. I've said this before. I own a Rolex. I own one Rolex. It sits in a safety deposit box, and I've worn it once, if that means anything to you guys. So be very careful if you are going after some of these markets for vintage luxury goods, whether we're talking about Rolex, whether we're talking about vintage jewelry, or even some of the more newer, nuanced markets like Hermes Birkin bags. You're going to have to devote a lot of capital to these markets. In my opinion, if you are going after watches, you want to go after vintage watches. Go after Rolex watches from the 70s or 80s. You can usually sometimes get them at a discount compared to their modern era counterparts. And if they are all original, if they have all the original paperwork, they were not restored in any manner, they will sometimes appreciate on the secondary market better than a modern era watch. I actually bought my Rolex that way. I bought a vintage 1980s Submariner, and I love it. It's probably one of the most favorite pieces of jewelry that I particularly own. Normally, I'm seen in an Apple Watch. I'm not wearing it today, but I would only wear the Rolex if I was involved in a special occasion, like if I got married or if I was going to a specific event where that particular watch would be warranted, then I would wear it. So I'm not really a fan of spending a lot of money on items that you wear, because items that you wear can easily be stolen or they can get damaged. And that's one thing that I will caution a lot of you guys who are getting into this market. If you do get into the vintage timepiece market, just be careful with what you do with the items that you buy. Understand that the market has risks that are very more pronounced than that of Wall Street, of other collecting categories, because you're typically going after items that on average are going to cost you anywhere from $6,000 to $7,000 on up. So you have to have a lot of money to play on that market. Words to the wise. Thanks, guys, for watching. Hope you enjoyed part 1. Part 2 will air within the next couple of days. If not, maybe a little longer. It depends. But there will be a part 2 that will air soon. Thanks, guys.